Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Nilanjan Sarkar and I'm Deputy Director of the South Asia Centre here at the London School of Economics. A very warm welcome to all of you to the 7th episode in our series Tough Talk, where we focus on an issue of contemporary relevance and discuss it with a panel of experts, issues and topics that are in fact important and relevant across the world, including in South Asia. It has been one of our most successful series, which we started in 2020. And as the title suggests, they're frank discussions on difficult topics. Earlier conversations have included whether museums should return objects, whether South Asians are racist, and also whether we should apologize for the past, also whether artificial intelligence is going to enhance spiritualism, and so on and so forth. That should give you an idea of the kind of things that we discuss. This afternoon, we are going to discuss how free speech really is in universities today across the globe. And I will not say too much about it because we have a panel of experts, and we also have the director of our center who will speak briefly just now about it. But I do want to point out that the topic has been framed in a way to include what we technically refer to as freedom of speech, as well as academic freedom. A very warm welcome to so many of you who've joined us from across time zones across the world. Thank you very much for your interest. Thank you also for writing to me to say how interesting you thought this topic was going to be. This event is happening via Zoom and is being live streamed on YouTube for all of you to see. The chat function is enabled, so you can type your questions over there. You are welcome to ask a question to an individual panelist, in which case please mention the name. Otherwise, you are equally welcome to ask a question to the entire panel, and I'll pose that question on your behalf in due course. If you're the kinds who tweet, then you can see our Twitter handle in front of you in the notes. Please do tag us when you tweet. I should add here that while it's always interesting to hear the names of whoever is asking a question, etc., you do also have a right to hide your name and ask just the question, in which case I'll literally just read out the question to you. Before I introduce the panelists and hand over to the director of our center, I do want to take a moment to say that of all the events that we have done in this series, this particular discussion has taken the longest for us to plan and to put together, principally because the topic is not only so important, but over the last 4 years in particular, it has gained momentum and has become differently important across the world in many, many countries in different ways, but in each instance affecting something that so many of us who are in the higher education sector took for granted all these years. The event and the panel discussion is also based on long conversations with colleagues, senior colleagues over here at LSE. And I want to mention particularly the name of LSE Law School Professor Conor Gertie. When the event was first conceived, I went and spoke to Conor about the event, and we spent a lot of time going back and forth trying to decide how we would frame it so it would give the correct message, and also how we would put the panel together. When I did finally manage to put this panel together, I wrote to Conor on the 7th of September, which was a Sunday, to tell him that it was finally in place, and he replied saying that I should send him the link to the recording because he was not going to be able to attend it, because today, the 5th of December, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he was going to speak at his local school to school children on issues of immigration and integration. This was on the 7th of September. Conor died unexpectedly on the 11th of September, on the Thursday, and is much missed by all of us who knew him, but is particularly remembered today. It is now my very pleasant task to introduce the panelists and speakers. As I mentioned, the director of the center, Naufel Vilcassim, will speak first. Naufel is Professor of Management and Director of the LSE South Asia Center. Our first speaker will be Adam Habib, who is Professor and Vice-Chancellor of SOAS University of London. Larry Kramer is Professor, President and Vice-Chancellor of the London School of Economics and Political Science. Niraja Gopal Jayal is Professor and Avantha Chair of the King's India Institute at King's College London. And the discussant for this afternoon is Tarun Khaitan, who is Professor Chair of Public Law at LSE. Everyone, welcome. Naufel, please speak now. Naufel, you will need to unmute yourself.
All right. Thank you very much, Nilanjan, and welcome to this particular event that we are organizing here at the LSE. And this is for the South Asia, not just for the South Asia region, it has become an important issue throughout the world today. And so the South Asia region, we have known that there are issues with respect to freedom of speech, more importantly, freedom after speech, not so much freedom of speech. But then the issue has also become important in the other parts of the world today. And so there are issues that are surrounding and sort of affecting the right of academics to say what they have to say. There's academic freedom as well as freedom of speech on the part of the students to say what they have to say. But there are also, it's not a left-right issue. It's coming from both sides. The attack is coming from both sides. And therefore, we have to be careful. We have to guide ourselves in a way that actually drives through the point without getting into too much sort of recrimination on any part, on any side. And with that in mind, I'd just like to hand it back to Nilanjan to take it over. And I said, broad welcome to this seminar on behalf of the South Asia Center. And thank you very much, Professor Larry Kramer and Professor Adam Habib for participating, as well as Professor Jayal from King's College and Tarun from LSE. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Our first speaker, whom I'm reintroducing because I'm watching the live stream in front of me and I can see that many of you are joining in now. Our first speaker is Adam Habib, who is Professor and Vice-Chancellor of SOAS, University of London. Adam, please speak now. You have about 8 to 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thanks, your colleagues, for inviting me to share my thoughts. What I will do is make 4 or 5 distinct points on free speech and academic freedom. And since I've only got 8 to 10 minutes, I'm going to be fairly quick. First, I would like to say that there is a problem in universities in the UK, in much of the Western world, and I would argue in much of the world as a whole, about academic freedom, about intolerance and silencing. This is not a figment of the imagination of the right. I think it's an important point to underscore. Yes, right-wing politicians can be hypocritical on how they approach it, but the challenge was not being addressed in universities for many years. Second, I don't like politicians legislating and regulating this. They do a terrible job of it and often act in politically partisan ways. But as I've said to fellow VCs in the UK and elsewhere, we created the political vacuum by failing to decisively manage the challenge. And the politicians used the gap and they stepped in. In any case, we are where we are. One of the challenges I have with the legislation, at least in the UK, and the debate more generally by colleagues, is they treat free speech and academic freedom interchangeably. But I think that they are distinctive. Academic freedom, in my view, is free speech aligned to the mission of a university. If the free speech is illegal or it's intended to create a silencing effect on campus, it violates academic freedom and needs to be addressed. Too many university stakeholders ignore this fact, and I think it's important to underscore. 4, the legislation and its explanation and application by the OFS, by government ministers like Bridget Phillips, have underscored this interpretation that I've articulated. Larry will tell you that VCs in the UK have received a letter from Arif in the OFF, from Bridget Phillipson, arguing that we need to protect Jewish students when they are threatened. And what it does mean is that they both acknowledge that where free speech threatens others and creates silencing effects, then we should be intervening. And I'm assuming that in the case that they spoke about was Jewish students, but they would see that as applying to all students and staff that feel threatened. So far, so good. Now for the challenging bits. Let me highlight two. First, I don't see the problem of free speech in a university as one of policy, but rather as a managerial conundrum. Let me give you a case, a concrete case. Imagine if some students and academic activists don't like the position of an academic, the political position that an academic is articulating, and they march on her or his office. They harass and threaten him or her. They spray red paint on the door. They follow the person around. This is clearly unacceptable, and no university would support it. But what should we do more than voice support? What if the activists are masked? This is where the conundrum is. And it seems to me that in what I have argued is universities need to do more than simply voice support. They need to proactively protect the academic, bring in professionals to identify those harassing her or him, discipline those associated with the university, and charge others that are not. We should act proactively in resolving the issue. And if it continues, suspensions and expulsions may even need to be considered. A second challenge. What happens if there's an academic conference on your campus by an academic association, and that academic association passes a political statement that demands, let's say, land restitution must be accepted by every academic for access to the university, and to the conference? This has become common by a number of academic associations where they demand land restitution must be a value that everybody accepts before they will be accepted into the conference. If they make that mandatory, then I would hold it violates academic freedom and the university should intervene. But what if it is voluntary? I must say I don't like it, but the law is more ambiguous. I would argue that the university shouldn't associate with the conference, but you could rent it premises, for instance. After all, we often allow academic conferences at universities that restrict participants who subscribe to established parameters. The Neoclassical Economic Society or the Marxist Theory Group, when they're thinking through those kinds of things. Ultimately, however, each specific context requires its own analysis, and one needs to think through whether we actually are violating the commitment of an institution to plurality. And then finally, I would hold, and by the way, both those cases I would hold are cases that are existing cases in the UK, in universities in the UK, and that have had to be dealt with. Finally, I would hold that rules need to apply equally to all. When we manage academic freedom challenges at the university, the focus should be on the conduct. Whether you are on the left or right is quite immaterial. Whatever your demographic characteristics are, that's quite immaterial. The same conduct should receive the same response. Rules should apply equally to all. This, it seems to me, is where the rebuilding of trust in universities starts. And for too long, in many parts of the world, in many parts of higher education across the world, we've treated conduct by different groups of people differentially. And that, for me, is just unacceptable. And I think it creates a really dangerous precedent. And so rules should apply equally to all. I'll stop there. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Adam. I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of this in the discussion. I'm now going to invite Larry Kramer, who's Professor, President, and Vice-Chancellor of LSE. Larry, please speak now. You have 8 to 10 minutes.
Thank you. And I think a lot of what I have to say is, not surprisingly, overlaps a lot with what Adam had to say. I think we actually, although we sometimes use different language, end up pretty much in the same position on most of these issues, as do most people in our position, which is just worth noting. So let me offer a couple points on free speech, a couple points on academic freedom, and then a couple of points on what I see as the real challenge that we have yet to be able to address successfully. So in terms of free speech, as Adam said, I think, a core commitment of the university should be to protect lawful speech, right? That is, say, if the speech is lawful, and I could go into, if anybody's interested, sort of how and why the law draws the lines where it does. But, and they're different in the US and the UK. The lawful free speech in the US is much broader. A lot of speech that in the US would be protected is unlawful in the UK. But wherever those limits are within the context in which you live, I think a university's commitment fundamentally needs to be to protect lawful speech. And that includes then, and by the way, of course, as I think this is now formally required by UK law. But even without it, I think we would all share this commitment. It's as long as what someone says is legal, we're not going to punish or condemn the speaker, and we're going to take action to prevent others from interfering with or shutting the speaker down. Okay. Now, that's easy enough to say and easy enough to sort of think you feel good about. When it comes to practice, of course, it gets really difficult because, the people who want to preclude someone from speaking have a reason for wanting to do that, which is they find the speech not just profoundly wrong and disturbing, but often they find it hurtful, they find it offensive, it frightens or threatens them, if not physically, then psychologically or emotionally. And, as universities, we can't and shouldn't just ignore that. So we want to create a university that's a community, and it's a community that's designed to be diverse and to challenge people. So if we're going to protect speech, knowing that lawful speech includes lots of speech that can be truly difficult and offensive for people to deal with, we need to do more than just say we're going to protect the speech. And so again, Adam, I think, was talking some about this. We need to build a culture for speech that's capable then of dealing with even the most challenging speech without trying to shut it down. So that means first, trying to create a culture in which the speakers themselves are more thoughtful about the words they choose, right, and the ways they communicate their ideas, and in which the focus remains on the idea as opposed to just trying to provoke or score points or grab attention by being intentionally hurtful. But even that, sometimes that's not possible, right? Sometimes it's the ideas themselves, however they're expressed, that can cause pain or trigger strong emotional reactions in people. Sometimes the speaker finds it necessary to use provocative or extreme language to make their point. I mean, speech and debate are not just about logic or reason. They also do have an emotional element to them. And we wouldn't want to strip that from the speech rights that we have. And even the most careful speakers trying not to do that will, from time to time, inadvertently or unintentionally, use language that hurts. And of course, if we're protecting free speech, there are going to be incidents when speakers do choose to use language that is designed to provoke and hurt. And as long as the speech is lawful, we're still going to protect it. So a part of building a better culture for speech has to include not just trying to make speakers more thoughtful, but knowing that there's still going to be hurtful speech, helping people become more resilient when that happens, which means providing support, but in a way that makes them more capable of dealing with challenging speech rather than dependent on someone to shield them from it. And that's important. It's super important inside the university, particularly because we're preparing students to go out into the world where they're going to confront this speech. And so I think part of our responsibility as educators is not to shield people, but actually to help them learn how to confront and deal productively and constructively with even speech that they hate or find deeply offensive. So different universities are doing a lot of things to achieve the right culture. I won't go into that now. We can talk about it in Q&A, what we're doing at LSE, what Adam can talk about, issues at SOAS and so on. Okay, so that's free speech. Academic freedom is a slightly different thing. It overlaps to a large extent, of course, because the purpose is similar to the purpose of free speech, right? The purpose is to create space for academics to freely explore ideas, including controversial ideas, including unorthodox ideas, and to be able to do that without fear of punishment or of being shut down for doing so. Academic freedom is broader than free speech, in that it covers some things that wouldn't be within free speech law, like an academic's decision about what area in which they want to do research or what classes they want to teach and so on. But the fundamental purpose is similar, which is to create a space for the free and open exploration and expression of ideas, even when they're unorthodox and so on. Now, academic freedom gets more complicated because there are some spaces in which it's inherently qualified. For instance, a teacher doesn't have the freedom to teach whatever class they want because you're putting together a program and you need certain classes, and certain classes don't fit the program. So the university has to have space to say, well, no, we need you to teach this class, and no, we're not going to offer that class because it doesn't fit within the agreements that we've made with students in terms of what they need to do to earn their degree. Similarly, academic freedom doesn't permit a teacher to do whatever they want inside the classroom. A teacher can't, for instance, intentionally bully students, or that is to say, your academic freedom inside the classroom is qualified by your professional obligation to not make some of the students feel unwelcome or ostracized, et cetera, et cetera. That's a complex set of issues, but it's definitely a qualification. And most importantly, academic freedom gets inherently qualified when it comes to decisions like hiring, promotion, or giving awards, because those kinds of decisions require, they can't be done without someone making judgments about the quality of the academic work. And although we would want a culture in which the people making those decisions are not making them based on dislike of the ideas, it's really hard to separate those two things in real life. I dislike ideas because I think they're wrong, but I think they're fundamentally, wrong. So we know that in those contexts, we're gonna have to say to someone, this work is just not within the professional standards or the requirements or the accepted principles that define this discipline. And as I said, there's no way to avoid that. And the most you can do there is try and create a culture in which, to the extent possible, there is real openness to ideas that are unorthodox and outside the mainstream. Now, the last point I want to make about academic freedom is there is currently an argument floating around to use academic freedom not as a shield to create space for academics to explore unorthodox ideas, but as a sword to punish some for doing so. And there was an argument that says a discipline defines a set of principles on what count, and things outside it, if you present yourself as an academic expert within that discipline and you're outside the discipline, you no longer have academic freedom, which means you can be punished for that. I think that is profoundly wrong, particularly since we can't avoid doing that to some extent on the decisions like hiring, tenure, and promotion. It's critically important that we not do it elsewhere, because otherwise we shut off the things that allow disciplines to grow and change. It is exactly today's unorthodox ideas are tomorrow's orthodoxy, unless we prevent them from ever taking hold in the first place. And they may not, but we have to be open to that at all times. Many of the people who push that argument today, I want to say to them often is, do you realize if a generation ago they had applied this idea, you wouldn't be here today? And so we need to remain open to really using academic freedom to allow people to truly challenge and work outside the accepted wisdom within their disciplines. Okay, the last point I want to make is just all of this, I think, is interesting and important. It sets the groundwork for what I think is really the biggest problem we face within universities, which is the controversial nature of speech, even when we protect it. And the way in which the speech environment works today, particularly with social media, has created a massive silencing problem. Our problem is not the speech that we're getting, it's the speech that we're not getting. And the people who are most silenced are the people for whom they don't want to have a knockdown, drag-out fight every time they want to talk about something. So the extreme reactions that we need to protect and are themselves creating a problem where many, many ideas are not being expressed, and more importantly, many people are not getting the chance or don't feel comfortable to express their ideas. And creating an environment in which we counter that, I think, is the biggest challenge we face as universities, and one that I don't think any of us have solved yet. But really, I think that's where the focus needs to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Larry. I'm now going to invite Niraja Gopal Jayal. Niraja is Professor and Avantha Chair at the King's India Institute in King's College London. Niraja, please speak out. You have about 8 to 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Nilanjan. Thank you for having me here. I should say that since I've been invited to speak to the Indian experience, rather than issues that are current in the UK. I actually wasn't sure why you would want to compare apples and oranges, but I'm guessing this is just to encourage crop diversity in the orchard. So let me start by identifying the chief differences, and I will briefly preface my remarks with a revealing report from the Indian newspapers yesterday. This report is about one of India's most prestigious public universities, the University of Delhi, that has just introduced a new rule requiring members of the faculty to submit their research papers for approval before they present them at any seminar, national or international, at any conference or any symposium. A university committee will scrutinize not just the content of the paper, it will also review the credentials of the body that is organizing the conference before it grants permission and approval for travel allowance. And to establish the credentials of the organizing institution, faculty members must provide documentary proof to support the standing of this body. This is just one random small example, but not insignificant, I think, of the way in which academic freedom is routinely compromised. But let me return to the apples and oranges. I just make 3 points. The first is to do with law. Let me start by clarifying that unlike the UK law that forms the background, in a sense, of our discussion today, India does not have a legal framework for the protection of academic freedom. What we do have is constitutional protection for free speech in general and for all citizens, but no legal provisions protecting specifically academic freedom. Even the jurisprudence on the subject of academic freedom is next to non-existent. India does have some international soft law commitments to academic freedom, but none of these are referenced in the laws and regulations governing higher education. In fact, it's telling that the phrase academic freedom does not occur even once in the National Education Policy 2020, which promises faculty autonomy to design curricula and for pedagogical approaches, but it says within the approved framework, and that qualifier is all important. The second difference has to do with this question of institutional neutrality. Constitutional provisions of free speech do not protect all opinions equally, and previous speakers have talked about the importance of all forms of speech being protected. Provisions for free speech in India operate differently for different opinions, in favor of some and to the manifest disadvantage of others. The speech that is disfavored may be termed seditious, sometimes in ways that entail a fanciful, if not fantastical, interpretation of the law. On the other hand, speech that we may consider hateful is likely to find protection if, and indeed because, it advances a partisan political project, because it is right and rightful, pun intended. In contrast to the position taken by Professor Kramer and Professor Habib here, the leaderships of public universities in India do take sides. Their approach is definitely not even-handed, let alone neutral or non-partisan. There is also no attempt to disguise their partisanship as neutrality. In fact, quite the opposite. The more visible, the better, because professional preferment depends on displays of political loyalty. And so implicitly or explicitly, and very often explicitly, the university does take a position, and that position is invariably partisan. Indeed, universities can be and often are more or less active participants in the way in which polarization gets enacted. In its most benign form, this is expressed in the mandatory formal observance or celebration of particular kinds of cultural icons or religious practices that are close to the heart of the ruling establishment, which makes them sound like PR agencies of the government. The instructions often come from the University Grants Commission, which, with the eager compliance of university leaderships, consistently amplifies the propaganda messaging that emanates from the ruling establishment. Now, this may offend one's aesthetic sensibilities, but arguably not much more than that. Much less benign is the influence of partisanship on practices of recruitment, where ideological affiliations count for more than academic merit, as is also the case with appointments of chairs of departments or deans of schools, or indeed when administrative approvals for innocuous everyday academic activities like sabbaticals or leave to attend conferences are withheld from those perceived to be of a different ideological orientation. And of course, it gets positively alarming when violence is mobilized. We have seen goon squads and vigilantes being unleashed in ways that violate campus integrity. And though such cases are thankfully infrequent, what has been notable whenever they have occurred has been the silence of university administrations and the inaction of the police as bystanders, both of which are suggestive of complicity, if not encouragement. In other words, campus violence can benefit from impunity depending on who is perpetrating it and against whom it is being perpetrated. To sum up this point, the acceptance or the condemnation of both opinions and violence are motivated by political partisanship, which is openly practiced by the administration of the public university. The third difference I would suggest is that in the structural conditions, which have for long, indeed since colonial times, been fundamental features of the university landscape. Universities have always been treated as departments of state and as such have lacked substantive institutional autonomy. The ways in which they are structured, the legal and regulatory frameworks that govern them, the limited institutional autonomy they enjoy, all these have enduringly shaped the quotidian practices and possibilities of academic freedom. Such academic freedom as has been enjoyed has been the result of benign indifference rather than a robust or considered commitment to the principle. The denials of academic freedom that we have seen in recent times represent the activation of existing levers of control in times that are hostile to academic freedom. They're just the most egregious expressions of the structural absence of autonomy, and they are evident in each one of the standard elements of academic freedom that we recognize from the 1915 Declaration of the AAUP onwards: the freedom to teach, research, and disseminate knowledge, the freedom of inquiry and research, the freedom to disseminate and publish the results of scholarly research, and extramural freedom. All of these have come under attack, and a catalogue of these can be found on the website of the India Academic Freedom Network. I do believe that the apple orchard has little to offer by way of comparison to this profuse crop of orange vexations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nirja. I'm so glad that you are here to say what you have just said. But this was precisely the reason why we had invited you, is to actually open up this whole question to say how questions like academic freedom and freedom of speech actually are functioning in very, very different contexts and frameworks in different parts of the world. Of course, you, because this is the South Asia Center, but this was the reason it was, and thank you very much for saying what you did. Our discussant for this afternoon is Tarun Khaitan. Tarun is Professor, Chair of Public Law at LSE. I should also mention that Tarun very generously also serves on the Faculty Advisory Group of the South Asia Center. So Tarun, please speak now. You can take this forward.
Well, thanks very much, Nilanjan, for having me here as a discussant, and I enjoyed all the three interventions very much. And so here are my comments. They're by way of glosses rather than hard disagreements, although there are finer points that I might press upon. So to start with, on perhaps primarily on Adam's presentation, and you mentioned commitment to plurality and even-handedness, and I fully see that I think a more fundamental problem that, or a prior question that we need to answer before we can really answer the problem of academic freedom is, what are universities for? And I think that question itself has become extremely, or at least there isn't a consensus on that question anymore today. And some of my comments will show why. I think the idea that the main purpose of universities is knowledge production and dissemination is not accepted by everyone, and not even by many of my academic colleagues, as certainly not the only purpose of universities. So, and that puts a lot of pressure on how we go about thinking about what are the limits of academic freedom. The second thing I want to mention by way of framing is something Larry already said, but just to emphasize it, that censorship is a key part of academic activity, not just in teaching, but peer review is a form of censorship. Who we invite for conferences and who we don't invite is a form of censorship. And there are disciplinary standards that, at least in theory, we hope we are applying to decide who the relevant experts are, who has sufficient expertise, whether the draft manuscript is offering anything to existing knowledge or not. So there isn't any commitment to plurality for its own sake, or even-handedness for its own sake. Universities do not have a balance duty that news media has, for example, right? And I think that's absolutely right, because I don't want to be balancing between a historian of the Holocaust and the Holocaust denier, who are not. So it's one thing to say that the discipline needs to evolve, is constantly internally contested. Its methods need to be internally contested. It's quite another to say that universities, like the press, have to be balanced and even-handed. And the question obviously is, when we move beyond the core activity of research and teaching, where we do make choices based not on ideology, but hopefully on what counts as knowledge and what is truth. How far does it extend to the people we invite, to the people we platform, right? And do you need to have? So this is some pressure on Larry's point. A non-historian or a pseudo-historian making claims about Holocaust denial, right? What is the university's duty to platform them or not? And I think that needs exploration. I don't think the answer is particularly easy, because the university is not Hyde Park Corner, and I think the specificity of the university needs to address that debate. The second thing I want to pick up, and this is maybe building some bridges between Niraja's presentation on India and Adam and Larry's presentations, based more on the Anglo-American debates, is I think what India shows us is that lawfulness of speech or an activity cannot be the sole determinant. Certainly not in India, but possibly not elsewhere either. And I say that because if academic freedom is anything, it has to be a freedom from the law as much as a freedom to act within the law. That it has to have a fundamental constitutional status which gives a modicum of autonomy to universities from the state and its laws, including when those laws are of the sort that Niraja told us, gave us only a small sample of what the Indian state is doing. I mean, the list is very long, and if she was recounting everything, we'll be here forever. So I think that legality, at least in terms of what our role morality is, cannot be the sole consideration. I get the pragmatic case for legality, right? As university leaders, you have to function, and the state has the power to shut us down. So I get the pragmatic case of taking legality seriously, but that is a different argument from taking legality too seriously in terms of our role morality and what we are to do. And I think there are contexts where I think universities must act illegally in breach of the law, in particularly vile under particularly vile regimes. And whether we are there or not, of course, is a matter that not everybody will agree on. Now, the final few comments I want to make are to put some pressure on Niraja's comments on Indian exceptionalism, because I don't think India is that exceptional. So for decades, the North, countries in the global North, assumed that democratic fragility was a problem of the global South. These new democracies with poor economies, and we know how wrong they were proved. And I think if the American experience in this calendar year is anything to go by, we must acknowledge that the state breathing down on universities, twisting their arms, putting pressure for blatantly partisan goals is not an Indian problem alone. I think it is a growing problem. It's a problem across the world, and I think any complacency from older established democracies that this cannot happen here is going to come back to bite them quite hard. So I think it's very important to see, to worry not just about academic freedom breached by universities, but academic freedom of universities breached by the state as important dimensions of academic freedom. And the final point I would make, I think, is perhaps common to universities everywhere, which is the commodification of universities and of knowledge. So this has not explicitly come up, but I think it is pervasive that corporatization of universities across the world, in the South and the North, is an extremely common issue. We do not have a consensus on the point of liberal education, knowledge for its own sake. We have pressures from progressive and reactionary governments for universities to instrumentally make a case for themselves, to show their value, and this value is always demanded in the short term, right? And a value for education that fits within the short-term education cycles, right? So I think all of us know that knowledge for its own sake serves an instrumental agenda, in that no knowledge is useless knowledge. We just don't know what it's useful for, right? But the institutionalization of the impact agenda, where unless you can show what policy tweak your paper will make in the next 2 years, has huge implications for the kind of questions we ask ourselves. The appointment of, and LSE and I take it SOAS are honorable exceptions, but the appointment of non-academic former CEO, vice-chancellors across British universities, who have a very different understanding of what universities are for, the shrinking space for humanities, the complete rolling up of, shutting down of humanities departments, shrinking of social science spaces. So all of these are a huge challenge, I believe, for academic freedom, but they don't enter the debate as an academic freedom issue, as a structural issue. And I think it's because it's not part of the culture wars, right? Our culture has fully embraced these changes for academic freedom. And I don't want to do an oppression Olympics here by saying which is the bigger issue for academic freedom. But I think unless we think of both the threat that the state poses to academic freedom and the threat that capital poses, and we've seen what donors can do in terms of academic policy, in terms of the issue on Palestine, and what forcing universities to take a very harsh stand against protesting students and things like that, right? So I think we have to think about the issue holistically. We cannot simply be guided by the flashing, blinding lights of our culture wars in our present time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tarun. Could I just ask Adam and Larry to respond? Nirja, I'll come to you after that. Respond to the one point that Tarun made by way of sort of trying to create a bridge, is that how would you as leaders of higher education institutions respond to state intervention or state interference, government interference, if it came to be, as it did, for instance, when Theresa May was Home Minister and she rescinded the visa of Jordan Peterson, who was coming on a fellowship to the University of Cambridge, because it was felt at that time by the government that his views would be too damaging to the fabric of the youth, or things on those lines. I mean, this is a possibility over here. It's not that it is completely impossible. This is one. The second thing, and I have no problems in saying that we at the level of a center face this in various ways, is the whole question of responding to all sidesism. You have to try and present all sides of an argument, which we try our very best to do. But there are instances, as Tarun was giving, where it's just not possible. And yet we enter into the whole question of platforming versus non-platforming. Are we making choices? I mean, everything is a choice at the end of it. Adam?
So I took two separate issues. Let me start by saying, I'm South African, and for much of my academic life, I spent it in South Africa. And I grew up as a student in apartheid South Africa. And South Africa is an interesting social laboratory because under apartheid, academic freedom was fundamentally a question of the state. It was using the examples very similar to India and some of the issues that Tarun speaks about. And so in many ways, when he says academic freedom may, under certain conditions, require you to stand up against what is an oppressive legal system, that's very true. And for much of my academic life, I grew up in that environment. In South Africa, that shifted to a far less state-driven system, and particularly it had some of the dynamics that Tarun speaks about, as does exist in other parts of the world, of corporatization, and how corporatization began to impact on the nature of the university and its production. But in many ways, South Africa post-1990 was a role model for academic freedom. It was written into our constitution. It was practiced vigorously by academics and students. And at least in a particular period in the post-2010 period, what I started reflecting on is that academic freedom doesn't always have to be threatened by the state or by corporate interests. It can also be threatened by political activists of the right, but also by political activists of the left, who are so driven by political passion that they treat the university as no different from a political party, that they see their political life as being driven through the institution and are prepared to violate the very mission of the institution. And so I've seen all of this partly because of an interesting experience. And when I come to SOAS in the UK, I see expressions of this. So, does the state intervene? The answer is yes. Many of the interventions are mild relative to an authoritarian state. They're legalistic, they're policy-oriented, and they try to control you through the legal and policy architecture. And that's the thing that's worth noting. But if you want to ask the question, Nilanjan, my answer is, if the politician were to do, if Theresa May did what she did, and I was in that position, I would object. I would go to court. I would compel the university to try and take action against that. Do you have to be pragmatic and operate within the law? Of course you have to. But that doesn't mean you will not challenge. But as much as I see the right to challenge Theresa May when she acts in that way, so too I will challenge a political activist that does a different kind of action against an academic and threaten them. And that must be something that is important. The second point I want to make is on, I have not said that every single event has to respond to all sides of the argument. That's not where I am at. I do believe an institutional culture needs to ensure that there's a plurality of discourses on all issues. And I think that doesn't have to happen in a single event. But I do think we must be willing to ask difficult questions. And part of the purpose of a university is to challenge its academics and its students to think in ways outside their comfort parameters, their emotional and philosophical comfort parameters. And if an institution is not doing this, then it's something that we should be very worried about as part of the institutional culture. I'll speak about how you can do that later and how you interfere. One final point, which I do want to say, Tarun, is part through peer review, through the way we choose students, through the way we assess, is that an important part of the academic project? The answer is yes. I wouldn't use the word censorship for that. Censorship is a very, very distinctive term. Using, do we assess? Do we make judgment calls on quality? Do we do all of those? The answer is yes. But that's a legitimate part of the professional academic project. Where that is different from censorship is when you're deliberately doing and denying somebody on elements that have nothing to do with the quality exercise, the peer review process, the established professional parameters of discerning what is good and what is bad, what we should accept and what. That is then censorship. And I'd make the big distinction between them. I'll stop there, sorry.
Thank you. Larry, did you want to respond?
Yeah, sure. A couple of different points. So first, on the question of how would I deal with, or how should one deal with government interference, which also goes to Tarun's point about sometimes maybe you do engage in activity that's not legal. Yeah, I think it's in some sense just the standard question of civil disobedience. The only thing I think one needs to note, though, so it may be appropriate for a university to think as an individual would about engaging in civil disobedience with the understanding that it has consequences. One of the things that's somewhat frustrating around today's protesters is they often assume that the exercise of civil disobedience because they're right means they shouldn't bear any consequences. But the whole point of it is you're demonstrating your commitment by your willingness to bear consequences. The thing that, though, makes it more difficult for a university is the consequences are not going to be felt by me. So I've talked to many of my American counterparts who are facing this very much with the Trump administration. And one, I won't say who, said, they started down that path and within a couple of weeks, he had to lay off 2,000 people. So the people who suffered there were, janitorial staff, young researchers, people whose lives are already precarious. So I think we have to be very careful when we think about as an institution exercising, but there may well be instances where that's appropriate. In terms of the question of presenting all sides, I think I basically agree with what Adam said, which is to say academic freedom itself actually would say we're not going to tell people who want to put on a program that you have to have all sides on the program. I think we need to leave them the freedom to construct the programs that they want, but we as an institution have to do as much as we can to encourage. That's our obligation. People need to understand and see the other sides of an issue. We can't command it, but we do need to try and create a culture in which it's all at least in there so people can learn and think and see, particularly given what we know is the silencing problem that exists within our institutions. Passivity may result in actually a side not being heard, not for good reasons or not for the right reason. Now, I just want to make a couple of then further points. These do in some sense respond to points Tarun made, Tarun, that was actually a great presentation. Just want to say I'm so proud you're here. Which is related to these. So one of the points Tarun made at the beginning too quickly that I think we really need to focus on is there is not consensus within the university currently about the purpose of the university. I think that's a really important point to understand. I am of the generation, perhaps, but certainly of the group that believes that universities have a special role in society's institutions, and that the reason we have to adopt the positions that we do with respect to being a platform for all ideas and not trying to tilt too much is because there are no other institutions that have that purpose. And so if we slide down the path, we run the risk of becoming just one more political institution taking sides on issues, and we lose the things that make us special and society loses as a result, which means to me, in other words, the core commitment is a kind of radical skepticism about the nature of truth. We are institutions that pursue truth while always being skeptical about whether we have it. My friend Josh Cohen once said, anybody who tells you they have truth has only shown that they don't take the concept seriously, which I thought was a wonderful way to express the point, that we're after here. And that's the challenge, of course, but I think that frames a lot of what we do. So then you take something like the Holocaust denier, or, I've gotten this presented to me in the form of, what about if somebody in the geography department wants to argue that the earth is flat, or somebody in the philosophy department wants to argue that slavery is a good thing? I mean, we can think of lots of examples like this. And that's where, as I say, I think the balance is built in effect, to the fact that one can't make decisions about hiring, promotion, and other kinds of rewards without taking those kinds of things into account. It's not possible. You have to be making judgments about the quality of the work. But that's why, for me, it's all the more important if it's not in that context. Yes, I think if somebody in my geography department writes an article saying that it's flat Earth, I do not fire them for that. That is within academic freedom. Holocaust denial, same thing. We have to manage that in the regular ways of debate that we do, because otherwise it's so easy to slide down that slope of, yeah, that one's easy, but what about this one? And we have so many historical instances of today's fixed, obvious truth becoming questioned that I think that's the radical skepticism point, and why we need to preserve it, at least where we can't avoid the judgments. And then just a word about what Tarun framed as the problem of capital, which also I think is an interesting one. Of course, it's a problem only because government has already backed out of its obligation to provide us with the resources that we need to run our programs. So it does become, and not so much an issue of academic freedom, but of the ability of universities to offer the full suite of things that you think they ought to, for given that special role that they have in society. And, I think we need a solution to that. The solution, since government is not about to step back up and provide the kind of resources that we need, and increasingly when government does step up, does so with its own sets of conditions that are themselves very much intrusions on academic freedom, the goal has to be to build a kind of world in which you can get the capital that you need for the university without those kinds of conditions. And I actually think that has been done with remarkable success broadly, although not entirely. The problem with disciplines disappearing is less one of capital telling us that we have to get rid of things than a larger societal issue, which is too few people seem to have interest in doing it. And then it becomes, we're not a business like a business, but we do have to, we can't spend more than we have. And so you get forced into decisions just regardless of where the money is coming from, that have to do with a loss in the society of an appreciation for the importance of a lot of the disciplines that I believe deeply are important, and that we have to find ways to preserve.
Thank you. Niraja, did you want to respond to some of the things Tarun said?
Yes, the point about Indian exceptionalism was well taken, of course. It's small comfort, but it is true. I did want to respond to the talk about corporatization that we've just been having. In India, the situation is actually quite interesting. Government funding for public universities is reducing at an alarming rate. Universities are being asked to raise money and revenue, universities in this part of the world have done for a while, are being asked to raise money, but also to take loans from something called a Higher Education Financing Authority, or else to run courses that people will pay for. And obviously, those courses are not in the humanities and social sciences. So they would be in engineering or medicine or whatever else. But the irony is that reduced state funding has gone hand in hand with greater and more oppressive state control. not just over the governance of the university, which is a constant for a long time, but also the content of teaching and learning. And that control has actually increased despite the, as I said, the irony of reduced state funding. And a second point aligned to that is that it's interesting that private universities, which are more lightly regulated, as we know, though they still come under the UGC's remit, they have actually also had academic freedom problems because though they are private, they are not dependent upon the state for funding, but they are dependent upon state governments, for instance, which have legislated them into existence. Bills are passed in the state assemblies. That's how they come into existence. And they are also dependent upon government for access to land to develop campuses. Oftentimes, because these are people with industrial backgrounds, they have multiple industries and they can be squeezed on other fronts. So there too, academics working in private universities have not managed to withstand the attack from outside. In fact, and this is another irony, it is probably faculty in public universities are probably more secure in a certain sense because of the governmentalization of the university system, the kind of provisions for tenure that you have, which are parallel to those of civil servants. That actually has provided faculty in public universities with some modicum of security in a way that faculty in private universities has not had. But I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I'm not mistaken, Niraja, public university employment actually goes under something called OIGS, which is on Indian government service, which is akin to that. Also, just because Niraja used the acronym UGC's University Grants Commission, I was going to pose a question actually to all of you, which came out from what all of you were saying, but I'm also very conscious of Larry's background in law. And it's in the context of what Adam said, which is that, do you think, all four of you, do you think having a law like has just been enacted in the United Kingdom is a form of state interference that actually reduces the space for institutions to do things on their own? Because if you compare it with the example that Niraja gave, where in India and in many other countries of the world, there is no such law, but there is a written constitution that, promises a string of things to its citizens, whereas Britain is one without a written constitution. So, the question is, where, if anywhere, do each of you see space to navigate and to maneuver these variously different, but in many ways similar, forms of intervention? Larry, since I took your name first.
Sure. So, my views on this may surprise you. So first, I wouldn't draw a distinction between something that's adopted as a statute and something that a court creates as an interpretation of the Constitution. So the question is just, what, if any, kinds of legal restrictions might we want to think about speech? I will tell you, surprisingly, I think most of the U.S. has much broader speech protections than anywhere else in the world. So I think, generally speaking, the ironic outcome of what most of the rest of the world has done is it facilitates a better, more democratic, a debate in which more people can participate freely than the U.S. version. And I experienced that directly. I will say the debates here in the UK, precisely by virtue of the speech that's not allowed, is actually fuller and richer. So if you get it right, it's a fantastic thing. You can also get it wrong. But that then just becomes a question of fighting out the law. To me, the UK Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, the problem isn't the value. All it really does in terms of the core value is put into a statute what was already UK law by virtue of constitutional understandings over a long period of time. The problem is they then, and this is a huge problem with the UK generally, the extent of micromanagement of how we go about implementing that value is needless, unfortunate, and unhelpful interference. And that's true not just on free speech. It's basically all the regulation that they do. It's like I want to say to them, tell us what it is you want us to do, and then give us the room to figure out how best to do it, and then punish us if we don't. as opposed to like making us go through all these hoops. You know, the free speech law has a ton of, I love this irony, right? It's got a ton of compelled speech. You know, you must say this, you must put this on your website, you must express your agreement and acceptance of this idea. I mean, and then it's filled with bureaucratic requirements that are costly and difficult to create. It's got all sorts of problems as a law. So as I say, the question is not whether we want some legal regulation of free speech. That's inherent. You have it no matter what, everywhere. The question is whether it's good or bad. And that's something we can argue about.
I was just going to ask you for a clarification because you mentioned it twice. Could you give an example of what you mean when you say that, you know, the vastness and the breadth of what is allowed as free speech in the United States is kind of negative in relation to what you experience over here?
So as I say, the debate that you have in the U.S., take even the debate over Israel, Gaza, Palestine that we've been having over the last couple of years. We had a lot of rigorous disagreement on campus. It never got as extreme as was routine in the U.S. The students here, they had lots of issues with each other, but they maintained actually an ability to communicate across that was very different. The students on each side were often made uncomfortable, but not in the same way or to the same extent. And likewise, I think by virtue of some of that, the silencing problem, while it exists here, is nowhere near as bad. And, you know, so, and as I say, I think it comes from, not from the legal regulation itself, but from the culture that gets created around it. So the speech in the UK generally is not as extreme on any issues and some of that's British culture, as it is in the US. And my sense is as a result, you actually have more robust debate.
Thank you. I know Naufel has a question. I know, Tarun, you want something to say. So what we go to Adam first and hear his response, and then Nirja, and then we come back. Yeah, Adam, please go ahead.
So I just wanted to say that, I mean, I agree with Larry. I don't think that the problem is with the legislation itself. But I find it really problematic when politicians start legislating and then starting to try and manage academic freedom in the kind of micro ways that Larry suggested is happening. Partly because they often act in politically partisan ways, partly because often they don't understand the complexities of how these things play out in universities, and often their advice is really ambiguous. And every time I listen to the conversations, I have to say, you know, you're just missing a whole series of things that you just don't understand around these issues. And so as a general rule, I think it's really unhelpful. I, however, do want to underscore this. I think that the reason the politicians were able to get involved is because there was a vacuum. I think that there was a real problem in universities, and I think it was really evident in UK university. I was quite struck coming from South Africa, how constrained people felt around talking about race. So critical gender identity and issues of Palestine and Israel, but also on other kinds of questions. And I was astonished at how constrained people are, the silencing effect. Now, maybe I came here in a particular moment about the time of COVID, all of these things had begun to play out post-Brexit, etc. And the broader culture within the society had shifted in such a significant extent. But I am convinced that it is the failure of people like myself in managing the problem proactively that allowed and created the vacuum for politicians to intervene. And yes, they do so hypocritically. And yes, they do so, you know, people say, well, the far right are hypocritical and they do it for political. What did you expect? Did you really expect the far right to do so on an impartial basis and to be you know, fair political interlocutors? So for me, the real question is, how did we create it? And the lesson to be learned, I wrote a piece about this a couple of years ago. I think that universities could have done more in developing a collective voluntary code on how to manage this so that we didn't allow external players to do so in the ways that they have. And I think that's the thing that does worry me. And we haven't figured that out yet.
Thank you. Nirja, did you want to come in just to
very briefly? Yeah, thanks, Nilanjan. Very briefly to say that, yes, I mean, if we had constitutional provisions protecting academic freedom, that would be marvelous, because at least you could go to a court and plead with the court. The kind of law that we are discussing here, which which all of you are referring to, that actually addresses a very small slice of the problem. The problem that we face is much larger. And a law of this kind, the kind that you have in the UK, would not be able to handle the kind of sledgehammer attacks, political attacks that we encounter. So, state interference is not something that a law of this kind can address. It's really about the silencing, the cancelling, and those sorts of issues, as far as I can tell. My limited knowledge of this law, but I don't think that this law can address the entire sort of universe of problems around academic freedom that we encounter.
My question or my response was more in the context of India and similar countries, because I think it's important to say that this isn't unique to India, was that whether or not having the law was in a certain sense, gave more room to think about various ways to navigate the situation. I wasn't suggesting that perhaps India and other countries should have a law. What I was saying was the fact that there isn't a law, is there any advantage to it? Because it could be restrictive, as you can see in this context. I mean, Nirja, you particularly, I mean, you've had the unique experience of having gone to college in India and then having gone to college in England, where you did your PhD over here, and then gone back and taught over there, and now you teach over here. So, you're able also to see the way in which legality can sort of, come in and catch hold of you over here.
But I think Adam is right. So first, again, you have a law everywhere, no matter what. There's no such thing as a like total free speech. The question is if you don't act responsibly with respect to how it plays out in your community, you would eventually invite intervention. And so, and then the intervention can be good or bad. But there is no non-law environment. And so it's just a question of, wanting to make it so that it's not necessary, or if it becomes necessary, wanting to make sure that it's done well.
All right, thank you very much. Let me ask a question for all the panelists, particularly Adam and to Larry. If you look at corporatization, right? So historically, if you look at many of the great universities in the US, were started by philanthropists, right? So sometimes called robber barons, right? So if you look at the Carnegies, the Andrew Mellons, the Rockefellers, the Stanfords, the Cornells, my own institution, were all started by people who made lots of money, but then they set up a governance structure that I think is very different from the capital that you see today. Do you have any comments on that type of corporatization?
Should I go?
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
Well, I've always been puzzled by the debate corporatization, because I think it means different things when people use it. I mean, one of the fascinating things that I've often found is that public universities in South Africa are not state universities like they are in other parts of the world. And ironically, when public universities, when they emerged into the post-apartheid period, the broader political climate enabled a very robust level of freedom that probably was second to none in the world for a particular period in time. There are other challenges, etc. But I think it's worth saying that the public universities can, depending on how the architecture is constructed, can have enormous freedom and enable enormous freedom for its academics and autonomy for its institutions. I also think that when people talk about the private universities in the US, those are kind of third sector institutions. They are institutions that charge fees, but they unlike some of the private universities in other parts of the developing world, where you pay shareholders dividends at the end of the day. The money that is collected by those institutions is kept for the benefit of the institution. Now, whether they spend it well or badly, that's a different question. But I also think that that's something that's worth bearing in mind. There's two additional things I would say. One of the things that strikes me quite interestingly is how dependent American universities became on research funding from state quarters, and how the federal state and the White House was able to utilize that. And one of the challenges I've always had at universities in South Africa here in SOAS, partly because I've had to confront how do you, as you get more and more money from private quarters, how do you make yourself less dependent on it? Well, the answer is the plurality. You have multiple players who help you, and it is in the diversity of the funding streams that you get some autonomy. And the only other thing I would say is what Larry underscored. There's very few corporates that are saying to university vice-chancellors, we want you to close something down, or we don't want humanities. What is really happening is a challenge about the funding, the political economy of universities, public and private, in the world. And that's fundamentally changed over the last 30, 40 years. As we've trained more and more people, as we want to enroll more and more people, the challenge of funding institutions has become a conundrum. And governments have responded to that in different ways. In many parts of the developing world, they've made it free, but the quality of education and the facilities have declined dramatically. In other parts of the world, they've charged fees and they've enabled cross-subsidization. In the US Ivy Leagues, I think that one of the models that they've developed is around endowments and trying to move towards needs blind. I think that's interesting, but sometimes I think some of these universities, the endowment became an end in itself rather than a means to an end to create universities where talented people from whatever background can come. I do think we need a much more nuanced conversation on corporatization and how it plays out in very different parts of the world.
Nilanjan, if I may jump in here to connect something that Adam said with the previous question on the bill, on the Free Speech Education Act. And I think, so there's a more fundamental problem here with liberal constitutional frameworks' inability to deal with things in between the public-private divide. And we see the same problem with political parties. We see the same problem with media. We see the same problem with universities. So things that are neither straightforwardly in the public/state box and things that are not straightforwardly in the private box. It's extremely complicated, and countries pick and choose. In the US, for example, political parties are treated like state bodies. In the UK, they are completely private actors, right? And it's just inability to see things in between and think of regulation accordingly is a huge problem that has huge implications for universities and their governance. So some of the things we are talking about today, right? And when I asked a question in my head rhetorically about whether universities are the same as Hyde Park Corner, right? I mean, the answer in my head was a clear no. And I want to link that to the act because I don't think the act is good, right? So, I mean, to Niraja's question, I have Larry's answer, which is it depends on what the law says. I think if the Free Speech Act in the UK fails to distinguish between academic freedom and free speech sufficiently. It uses both terms, right? But the primary duty to promote free speech assumes that universities are like the state, right? So you don't have, as a private individual, Nilanjan, and neither do I, a duty to protect free speech, right? If somebody wants to come up and put a poster, whatever it might say, on my house walls outside, I have no duty to respect their free speech, as it were, right? The state, on the other hand, does. Now, what does that make universities? Are they more like state? Are they more like individuals? And when we talk about universities and the academy, it's not one individual, right? There's a corporate entity called the university. There are individual scholars, there are students, there are student unions, there are journals, there are, all sorts of different institutions and entities within them. Some of them are more public than others, and some of them are more private than others. So I think the law should have simply impose a duty to promote respect and fulfill academic freedom, and stopped there. So my response, to go back to the Holocaust denier, right? This is sort of the boogeyman, but not really. My response to that is that it depends on how a university should treat the Holocaust denier. And this is where the distinction from Hyde Park Corner comes in, because Hyde Park Corner, public sphere, free speech, whatever you want, you can speak, right? In a university, which is, I don't think should be applying the free speech test, but the academic freedom test, the question is not what you're saying, but what are the bases on which you're saying that, right? Do you have an accepted or within the range of reasonableness, and I know it's a dynamic disciplinary question, right? It changes, but on the best available current best practices of discipline and methods, right? Or even a reasonable criticism of those, right? Do you have an academic argument, right? And if you do, then we absolutely must respect and promote it, right? If somebody just wants to come and rant, then I don't think universities should have any duty to respect their freedom of expression, because we are not the state, and we must insist that we are not the state, we are not part of the state, even though the state has duties towards us, and we obviously may have duties towards the state, right? The final thing I would say, and this is to Larry's point about the US and the UK, right? That we judge free speech in terms of formality, right? What is the formal status of the law on free speech in a jurisdiction? I think it's about time we start thinking about the state of free speech in a jurisdiction based on the size of its Overton window, right? What are the things that are sayable in that jurisdiction without fear of backlash, whether societal, whether political, whether legal, right? How free do I feel to say unpopular things? And if that is the standard, then the Overton window in the UK is much broader than in the US, despite their so-called free speech absolutism. Right? So I think that is absolutely right. And that Overton window in relation to academic freedom, I absolutely think universities have a duty to keep expanding and keep pushing. But the method is critical to me. I don't think this is a subject matter based distinction of what you are saying, but how you are saying it and how you have arrived at that conclusion. So out of the received wisdom, conclusions are extremely welcome and promoted, but done in the right way, done in the scholarly manner. That would be my test, and which is why I think the act is bad, because it imposes a free speech duty on us and not just an academic freedom duty on us.
So let me, because I actually disagree on that point, but largely because, well, for two reasons. One is I honestly think there's not a clear line between the sort of what's a scholarly argument and what's a rant. And it gets blurry very fast, and one person's rant is another person's scholarly argument, and so on. And I think our obligation as an institution should be to cut in favor of the more speech protective. Particularly, though, again, I don't think anybody should be able to come on campus and rant about whatever they want. So the controls come in the invitation side, right? I mean, the way the law works, we don't have to invite anybody, but once they're invited, we can't uninvite them because some people object to the speech and so on. So there's more balancing that goes on there. And I think we all end up in relatively close to the same position. For me, as I say, the risk is I'm nervous anytime somebody wants to be saying we're not going to allow that speech because it's wrong. And that to me is the risk, whatever label that goes under. I want to say a couple of things, come back to the corporatization. That's not how we frame it where I come from, but that debate, the public-private debate, which is, so one is there is this something has happened in the broad discourse over the last 50 years or so, where we assume that we can only understand people's positions in light of what we understand to be their underlying material interests. And then we assume that they're always doing things to pursue their underlying material interests. So many of the great universities, as Naufel said, were founded by robber barons. Stanford was Leland Stanford. By the way, you want to talk about really interesting beginnings. It was founded by Leland Stanford. Of course, he died relatively young. His wife, Jane Stanford, took over. And in this probably the strongest possible effort to secure academic freedom, the president of the university 20 years later murdered her, as we now know. I don't know how many of you have read that story, but Jane Stanford was actually poisoned. Anyway, that's not the way to go about it. But I think you look at a lot of these, these great universities, they were founded by people who wanted to create great universities and didn't interfere in any way. So Stanford, the University of Chicago, Rockefeller, these are amazing institutions because the people who founded them, whatever the source of their money, like you can't pollute what they did as a result of that. And that was not what they were trying to do. I make that point largely because in my experience in the US, the vast majority of universities were started by private individuals. State schools are a latecomer to it. But over history, and particularly over the last century, by far, the bigger threat to academic freedom has come from the state. Over and over and over again, it is in the state universities where the politics of the moment have them putting pressure on the universities to do this or not do that in ways that go well beyond what private donors have done across any of them. I mean, what we saw happen last year and the year before with donors coming out wanting to punish the universities because they were too pro-Palestinian and not whatever, that was an extraordinary thing that really has never happened. And I think it's of a concern. And I think universities are already trying to figure out we cannot work with private donors if they're going to approach us that way. And that has not been the practice. And it's much easier to work with a private donor in ways where we're going to take your money, but you have to understand the nature of this relationship than it is with the state, which operates with a very heavy hand. So I think that's worth keeping in mind, which only takes me to the following point at the end. State-run model run on private donations, mixed model. We have to think about the models there pragmatically. Like, what's the alternative? I would love to have a university where I didn't have to worry about fundraising, where I didn't have to build an endowment and so on. But I know in the real world what's going to happen if I try and go that way, right? So if I want to have a university that thrives, there are risks and problems that come with going down that path. But the assessment might be those risks are less than the benefits I'm going to get relative to the risks and benefits of not going down that path and having to, depend and live in a world where if the British government sneezes, I'm going to be in the hospital. My institution's going to be in the hospital. And so we just have to think about how to mix public and private, pragmatically in the world in which we live and what we're going to get.
Can I just make one footnote there, Larry, which is that I mentioned the problem as commodification rather than corporatization, and they're very different things. So it is a certain type of value system that has become embedded in British universities, more so than American universities, which has displaced the value of what we are here for, which is knowledge production.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I don't think it's less of a problem in the US than here, but it's a larger cultural problem, but it's a huge one. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious of time, but I just wanted to give Nirja the chance. If you wanted to respond to any of the things, were you absolutely fine? Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, everyone. This was exactly what we wanted to do, was to have this fantastic conversation. You're all very busy. And I always end all our online events by saying this, that if there's anything good that came out of the COVID pandemic, it is that we all became technologically savvy and are able to convene these panels. But we also cannot do it if all of you don't give your time and your expertise as freely as you do. So thank you very, very much for this. Larry Kramer, Adam Habib, Nirja Gopal, Jayal, Tarun, Khaitan, on behalf of Naufel, Vilcassim, and me, goodbye.
Thank you.